Hello, I'm Rabyd, otherwise known as the Rabyd Atheist, a former pastor turned atheist, now compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. Feel free to like or dislike the video as you see fit, so feel free to hit those buttons. Feel free to comment below, and I would appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel and hit your notification bell for more content as it is released. You're also free to share my videos as much as you like. The purpose of this channel is educational in regards to atheist and deconversion issues, and Bible, theology, politics, philosophy, and relationship to those issues. Today I am about to restart a project that I originally started when this channel was very young, right at the beginning, called The Tall Tale of Jesus. I originally did this series, and I will link the playlist for that series, the original Tall Tale of Jesus, above my head. In that series, my attempt was to basically illustrate, and basically the same is going to be true for this series, illustrate the nature of the growing legend of Jesus Christ as illustrated by the Gospels themselves. Now, most people look at the growing legend and they put in all the pseudo non-canonical Gospels, so-called, and show that how that is an arc that grows the legend. But in my case, I'm looking at this purely as a tall tale that has grown, and I don't really need that. I can actually look at the Gospels themselves. This is a slightly different variant than what I did before, because I'm going to add a criteria for my judgment that involves specifically this tall tale aspect. Now, I have to go into a little bit of my background this time, as much as it pains me because I've done it many times, in regards to the life of Christ. Because the life of Christ actually is quite pivotal in my deconversion in this sense, that it became part of where I began to realize that if the gospel writers were truly inerrant, they made a lot of mistakes. And that kind of undercuts inerrancy. I'd also would say, how could a God inspire these stories when each of the gospel writers seems to have an axe to grind that is their own theological variant that in times contradicts with the other gospels? Now, in this particular case, I'm looking at this as a disharmony of the gospels. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that as I studied the life of Christ over many years, just for a little background, I studied it when I was in Bible college as a freshman. It was a required class. I gained an immediate interest in the life of Jesus and harmonies of the Gospels, and I think in my pastoral library, before I got rid of it, I had 4 or 5 harmonies of the Gospels, because that's how interested I was in the topic of Jesus Christ. And rightfully so, because Jesus Christ is the central figure of Christianity. And the witnesses that we have are the 4 Gospels, supposedly. So my natural inclination was to look at the life of Jesus and try to harmonize the Gospels to make them fit, to make them work together. The reason why people harmonize the Gospels is simply that's the case. You know, you're trying to make the story into one big story by using the 4 storytellers. The way I used to put it is you try to look at each witness as kind of a cameraman on the scene when they're covering the scene, and then you try to get the 2 different angles of the 2 different cameramen and make it line up. The problem is I'm going to demonstrate that sometimes the cameramen are on completely different Jesuses, and it's quite simply true that the various gospel writers, absolutely sometimes disagree with each other and even correct each other on a couple of occasions. Now, this creates a lot of problems for Christians, but I have designed this series actually to be for people that are Christians and just, want a different take of how Jesus's life could be looked at. And I'm taking it slow this time. It may take me quite a while to get this done, but I do want to pursue it and continue to pursue it once again, because I think it's an important project in the fact that a lot of people look at the life of Jesus as their bedrock. And the only reason they do that is they think that the 4 Gospels are inspired and inerrant. And I'm about to pretty much prove that that is not true. My scholarly background is having a degree in biblical studies, having a degree in theological studies, kind of researches this. And in my churches, I taught Life of Christ probably 5 times, twice in my associate days when I ran a Bible Institute, and probably once at least in each one of my churches I taught Life of Christ. And it was a very popular class in all cases. I'm not trying to, in any way, going to contradict some of the conservative assumptions in this study. Part of the things that I am going to do is I'm going to say, fine, let's just take your conservative assumption that Mark wrote Mark and John wrote John and Luke wrote Luke and Matthew wrote Matthew. Now, I'm going to say right now that for me personally, I know that that's probably not true. The writings of these Gospels are definitely 2nd century, so none of the apostles could have been around, or eyewitnesses for that matter, could have wrote them. That's my official. But I don't need to criticize who the writers of the Gospels were to show the problems with the Gospels. So I can grant the conservative assumptions that these were writers of the Gospels, and Mark wrote Mark, and Matthew wrote Matthew, and so forth. I can even grant that they maybe wrote them in the 1st century, if that's the way you want to play it. From my perspective, it doesn't make a difference, because the criteria that I'm using have nothing to do with who wrote the Gospels or whether or not they wrote it at such and such a date. My criticism of the life of Jesus Christ is as follows, and the categories that I am going to use for analysis are, threefold. Number one, like the original series, I am looking at the 2 or 3 witnesses claim of Christians. Christians claim that Jesus is a historical figure because we have 3 or 4 witnesses of his life, and therefore those witnesses constitute multiple biographies of Jesus and therefore should treat it as multiple biographies. I am going to point out how that is not necessarily true, that each story, sometimes many of the stories of Jesus only have one witness, only one gospel talks about them. Or when they do overlap, it's pretty clear that a couple of them copied from the other one. In particular, probably the most prominent person that is copied from is Mark. Mark is definitely copied from by Matthew and Luke. There are other problems that I could talk about, such as the synoptic problem and many other problems, which will be germane to this idea of 2 or 3 witnesses. But the main issue, of course, is this oral tradition that is preserved by these gospel writers. We have no names. We have nothing. We have no names of who wrote these gospels either. We literally have nobody to check. And that's a real problem. But once again, I don't need it for the work that I'm going to do on the 2 or 3 witnesses, because I have to ask the question at that point, was there 2 or 3 witnesses to every event of Jesus' life that survived? The other criteria I'm going to do is basically contradictions, historical criticism, archaeological criticism. There's a ton of criticisms of each of the events of Jesus' life. And quite frankly, there's tons of things as a critic that I could write on, and I want to mention those in passing. While I am going to stay away from the authorship and date of writing questions because I don't need to do them, any other criticism that I could level at the text, including whether or not it just plain makes frickin' sense, I'm going to do that as well. I want everybody to understand that that's a criteria that I'm doing. Now, these 2 criteria were the original criteria for the original Tall Tale of Jesus. And this is something that I want everybody to understand. But I've added a third, because I realized that the one thing the original series was missing was the basic understanding and conversation around how something was indeed a growing legend. How did Matthew and Luke add to the legend of Jesus Christ? And how did John completely add to the legend of Jesus Christ? These are all things that we need to look at if we're going to claim that Jesus is nothing more than a growing tall tale. This is kind of the new route that I'm taking, and another reason why I wanted to do this series over again. And I want to keep going at it. As we hit each episode in Jesus' life, I will probably bring up other things. And that is one critical change from last time to this time. I'm not really going to do an introduction so much as jump right into the life of Christ with the next video. The reason I want to do that is as I go through the life of Christ, I'm going to talk about the various other criticisms, including authorship and things like that. But I'm also going to make the remark, once again, I don't need it. But I think in looking at the actual life of Christ as found in the Bible, I'm also going to be able to show different things that need to be shown in the text. And this is something that I've wanted to do since I wanted to redo it. Because the other thing that makes me want to redo this series is I'm a little bit more adept at the technology involved in making a presentation like this. I want to be able to put overlays and things like that, like the criteria overlay that I just showed. I want to be able to show people that, this is what the text says. This is why there's a problem. I want to be able to highlight the problems and the changes and why they're significant and important. And now that I have a little bit more technical expertise in making a video, I can certainly do a little bit better job than the original series. And so that's another reason why I want to do this. The original Tall Tale of Jesus never was completed. I can't say that this one's going to be completed either, but I'm going to press towards it, and that is going to be my goal. My main objective here is to simply point out that all the claims of Christians, that this is inspired, that this is inerrant, that there are 2 or 3 witnesses to Christ, that there's true history in the Gospels, that there's some sort of, there's no contradictions in the life of Christ in the way the story is presented. My goal is to prove all of that untrue by using the Gospels themselves. And this is something that's going to be very challenging if you're a believer watching this series, because all I'm really asking for you to is engage the evidence and keep your mind open and look at the things that I say. These 3 criteria, the whole idea of whether there are 2 or 3 witnesses, the various historical and contradictory criticisms I could level, and thirdly, what evidence does this show actually that there is a legend growing about this man from Jesus, Jesus from Nazareth? These are the 3 criteria I'm going to use throughout this series. And it's all I really need to do to prove that not only is Jesus Christ a tall tale, but that there is just no way to harmonize the Gospels. They are disharmonious by their nature. This is something that people need to understand. I'm not doing this because I don't find, I find some sort of joy in making people's faith shipwrecked. I simply want to point out the truth and the alternatives and the various scholarship that has been done in the life of Jesus since. Now, people ask me at this point, do you believe that Jesus was a myth or a legend? I'm going to say that both are reasonable possibilities. It is quite possible that Jesus is a complete made-up character, and basically the gospel writers started to make him up as a way to justify some of the teachings they were presenting in gospels that just had teachings that are very early on. But here's what I really think. I think it's a good theory, a good possibility that Jesus of Nazareth was a real person and that he had a real life and that he was a real rabbi, and maybe indeed he was controversial. And because of that controversial nature, the Sanhedrin perhaps did have him killed. Now, probably not in the grandiose way that is described in the various gospels, but very simply, and then he was thrown into a mass grave where he was buried and lost to history until some of his followers decided to write down his teachings. Later on, people began to talk about his life and different stories about his life. Then Mark comes along and actually kind of puts that first biography together. And then we're off and running, because after that, Matthew and Luke write. And much later than that, John writes, and then there's a whole other gospels that come after that that get even more and more far-fetched. But I don't need those gospels before or after. My personal belief is that there's always a kernel of truth to some of these stories and some of this mythology. And I think very possibly that Jesus of Nazareth was a rabbi who simply did the wrong thing to the wrong people and found himself in a very bad situation where he got killed. And in mourning, his followers basically start to make up stories, resurrection stories, whatever, and begin to create this tall tale of Jesus that starts with just his teachings. And then somebody asks, well, what was he like? What was he like as a person? And eventually they start to create the Christ myth, the Messiah myths, and the various other myths that start to revolve around Jesus. And as the story is told and retold and retold, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And by the time the Gospels writers have written it down, it's even bigger than they ever thought it could be. Now, that's kind of going to be the nature of this series. These have been my opening remarks about this. The next video will begin to actually dive right into the life of Jesus. And as different things come up, as different examples come up, I'm going to make mention of those and deal with them at that time. I want to thank you for stopping by. I appreciate you coming here, and I appreciate every like, share, and subscribe to the channel. It really helps the channel grow, and I keep continuing to grow and continuing to do what I want to do. I also have a Facebook page called the Rabyd Atheist. I'll leave the link in the description. You're more than welcome to follow me there. It's a good way to get more information about the channel. I usually post all the videos there, and I also, on occasion, make announcements and things like that. So it's a good way to keep track of the channel without necessarily coming to YouTube all the time. Once again, I want to thank you for stopping by, and hopefully I can convince you to be a rabid atheist like myself. In the meantime, this is Rabyd, also known as the Rabyd Atheist, saying, have a good day and goodbye.